At first glance, she was a grieving widow rebuilding her life in Singapore, a vision of charm, poise, and redemption. An American expatriate with a magnetic presence, she seemed to have found peace in her new home, far from the shadows of her troubled past. But one quiet morning in Jurong West, that illusion shattered. A teenage boy returned home to find his father dead in a pool of blood. Stabbed 42 times. And his stepmother? Gone without a trace. What the public didn't know, what police would soon uncover, was that just days earlier, the boy had confessed something so dark, so twisted, it would rock Singapore to its core. A secret affair. A pregnancy. And a woman spiraling into madness. This wasn't just a broken home. It was a ticking time bomb. What drives a woman to destroy the very family that gave her a second chance? How does love curdle into obsession, and obsession into murder? Before we dive into this harrowing case, like this video and subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales of love, lies, and lethal betrayal. In the heart of Jurong West, Singapore, hidden behind the closed doors of a spotless, modest HDB flat, lived 39-year-old Ray Winston. Ray was an African-American expatriate who came to Singapore 8 years ago after marrying a well-respected Singaporean logistics executive, Chia Meng Fong. To neighbors, she was the picture of elegance, an African-American expatriate with refined manners, a radiant smile, and just the right touch of mystery. Most assumed she was simply a woman who had found love overseas, a new life far from home. What no one knew was that Ray had crossed oceans not for love, but to escape a gruesome truth that began thousands of miles away in Detroit, Michigan. Ray had always been a complex woman, brilliant, passionate, deeply charismatic, but haunted. Before Singapore, before her manicured nails graced charity luncheons and temple altars, Ray had lived in Atlanta, Georgia. There, she was a former schoolteacher and the wife of a well-respected high school principal. They were both married for 3 years. On the outside, they were a promising young couple. But behind the closed doors of their neat suburban home, Ray's world was crumbling. It started with a strange letter. Then a second. Then a knock on the door from a woman claiming her child was Ray's husband's biological son. At first, Ray laughed it off, an obvious scam. But as the letters piled up and DNA tests began circulating online, a terrifying pattern emerged. Her husband had been secretly donating sperm to fertility clinics across the southeastern U.S., under a fake name, for years. Over 70 children, confirmed, had been conceived from his anonymous donations. Ray, who desperately wanted a family of her own, who struggled with abandonment and an undiagnosed bipolar disorder, fell into a tailspin of disbelief, paranoia, and rage. She said he had violated the sanctity of creation. She accused him of selling pieces of their future. Friends later recalled how she stopped sleeping, stopped eating. She started quoting scripture with a disturbing intensity. Then, one night, it happened. Ray prepared his favorite dinner, rosemary lamb and red wine, and laced it with prescription sedatives. As he drifted off, she tied him to their bedposts with silk ties from their anniversary trip to Savannah. And as he slipped in and out of consciousness, she straddled his chest and smothered him with a pillow, whispering verses from Genesis and Revelations. When it was over, she placed a handwritten note on his chest. It read, "You gave life to strangers but not to me. Now you're everyone's father and no one's husband." By the time police arrived, Ray had wiped the apartment down, planted empty pill bottles by his bedside, and staged the scene to look like a suicide. With no next of kin to push for further investigation, the case quietly closed. The death of a beloved school principal was ruled an overdose, a tragic end to a man everyone thought they knew. 2 months later, Ray Winston boarded a plane to Asia under a different name. She landed in Singapore and vanished into a new identity, one she wore like silk: grieving widow, Christian woman, survivor. She told no one about her past. And no one thought to ask. Then came Chia Meng Fong. A 52-year-old logistics executive and widower, Chia had lived a quiet life since the death of his first wife. Traditional, soft-spoken, and deeply spiritual, Chia was drawn to Ray's southern grace and magnetic warmth. She reminded him of hope. Of love. Of second chances. They met at a religious conference, and within months, were inseparable. Ray dazzled his colleagues with her poise and piety. She smiled through Sunday services, joined Buddhist temple charity drives, hosted elaborate brunches at their flat in Jurong West. She even started a modest lifestyle blog featuring tea ceremonies, scripture reflections, and tips on cross-cultural marriage. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of grace, a living testament to healing and reinvention, but behind the filtered photos and floral dresses, something darker was stirring. Ray hadn't buried her past. She had simply changed its name, and no one, not even Chia Mengfong, knew the storm he had invited into his home. To the outside world, Ray Winston had fully bloomed into a picture of elegance and redemption. In the leafy heartlands of Jurong West, neighbors and fellow expats knew her as the graceful American woman with a charming southern drawl and a warm, disarming smile. Her social media was a curated gallery of inspiration. Filtered selfies at brunch, glossy temple visits, midweek Bible verses, and occasional snapshots with her soft-spoken teenage stepson, Javarian Javi Chia. She called him her miracle boy, hashtagging photos with hashtag blended family, hashtag second chances, and hashtag blessed. She was spiritual. Refined. A breath of fresh air, some would say. Local aunties nodded in approval as she exchanged oranges during Chinese New Year. In church, she sang gospel with her eyes closed, hands raised to the ceiling, as if redemption was something she could summon and were like perfume, but behind the pristine windows of their modest HDB flat, Ray was unraveling. What the world didn't see were the nights she wandered the living room in a trance, talking to herself in tongues, her eyes wide and distant. What they didn't hear were the sermons she recorded into her phone at 3 a.m., proclaiming herself chosen, reborn, the mother of kings. The truth was, Ray was not healed, she was haunted. Her untreated bipolar disorder roared beneath her surface like a dormant volcano. At times, she was euphoric, spending sprees, grand visions, hours of frenetic cleaning or cooking as if possessed by purpose. Then, just as swiftly, she'd collapse into depressive silences, lost in shadows that stretched far back to her abandoned childhood and the crimes she left behind in America. The manic episodes were getting worse. Her delusions louder. And there was one obsession that refused to loosen its grip. Javarian Javi Chia was Chia Mengfong's only child, a quiet, introverted 17-year-old with a passion for sketching, poetry, and vintage horror films. Reserved and sensitive, he had never quite warmed to his father's new wife, though he respected her boundaries. At first, Ray, on the other hand, seemed overly invested in her role as stepmother. She insisted on making his lunch daily, attended every parent-teacher meeting with performative pride, and posted elaborate birthday tributes with captions like, "The son my womb never knew but my spirit always carried." At first, it felt like overcompensation. Then, it turned strange. Her compliments toward Javi grew increasingly intimate, praising the shape of his lips, the strength of his hands, the softness in his eyes. She'd brush lint off his shoulder and let her hand linger just a second too long. She bought him colognes. Started walking around the house in sheer nightgowns. Left her bedroom door ajar. Javi didn't know how to process it. He chalked it up to cultural confusion or her eccentricities. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. What began as maternal concern had now taken a sinister turn. At first, it was subtle. A compliment here. A lingering touch there. Ray would casually comment on how much Javi had grown, how handsome he looked in his school uniform, how no girl out there would ever understand him like she did. She began walking around the house in silk nightgowns, whisper thin and clinging to her frame, brushing past him in the kitchen, bending just a little too far when picking something up. It was confusing. It was calculated. And it was escalating. Over time, her words turned explicitly sexual. She'd ask about his body, his fantasies, his dreams. She'd creep into his room at night, sitting on the edge of his bed, stroking his hair like a mother, then resting her hand somewhere it didn't belong. When Javi turned 18, the line shattered. One night, under the guise of comfort, Ray crawled into his bed and seduced him. What began as grooming turned into a full-fledged, incestuous affair, illegal, perverse, and devastating. For months, it continued in the shadows. Javi, torn between disgust and despair, didn't know how to escape. He was young, isolated, manipulated by a woman who held all the power in his life. Every time he tried to pull away, Ray pulled him closer, crying, apologizing, then promising they could be together if they just left everything behind. She'd whisper, "We're soulmates," and, "God brought me to you for a reason." When emotional blackmail didn't work, she turned cruel. "Leave me," she said once, "and I'll tell everyone you raped me." And then, everything changed. Ray missed her period. When she found out she was pregnant, it was like watching a mind already on fire explode into ash. She knew the baby was Javi's. There was no one else. No more pretending. No more controlling the narrative. Her delusions wrapped tighter around her like a straitjacket. She sent Javi dozens of texts a day, some begging, some threatening. She spoke of fleeing to Bali or Thailand, of starting a new life with him and their child, as if they were star-crossed lovers trapped by the world's misunderstanding. But Javi, horrified and drowning in guilt, refused. That's when the threats began. She slashed his school uniform with scissors. She smashed his laptop with a cast-iron pan. She ripped the Bible in half and screamed that God had no place in this house anymore, not after what we've built. She accused him of betrayal. She told him she would end anyone who got in the way of their love. And by then, Javi realized, this wasn't love. This was madness wearing a mother's face, and it was only getting worse. Chia Meng Fong had always been a quiet, attentive father, but in recent months, something about Javi had unsettled him. The boy had changed. He no longer played music in the afternoons or scribbled cartoons in his sketchpad. He barely touched his food, his once gentle nature replaced by a distant, haunted look. At first, Chia chalked it up to teenage angst. But then came the silence, the kind that screamed louder than words. One evening, while Ray was out grocery shopping, Javi stood trembling at the edge of the living room. His eyes were swollen, his voice cracked. "Dad. I need to tell you something. You're not going to believe it." Chia urged him to sit down. What spilled out next made his blood run cold. "She's pregnant," Javi whispered. "And it's mine." Chia stared at his son, stunned into stillness. Javi broke down in sobs, choking through the horror. He told his father everything, how Ray had started walking around in lingerie, praising his body, sliding into his bed late at night. How she told him they were chosen by God, how their love was sacred. How she manipulated him with threats, with affection, with guilt. And how he couldn't tell anyone, because she promised no one would believe him. It was too much for a boy to carry. Too dark, too twisted. Chia listened, heartbreaking, stomach churning. And underneath the shock and rage was shame, shame that he hadn't seen it sooner. That he'd invited this woman into their lives. That he'd believed in her redemption. 3 days later, Chia quietly contacted a lawyer. They met in private, away from the flat. Chia wanted to know how to proceed, how to report Ray without further traumatizing Javi. The attorney urged caution. Document everything. Keep her calm. Do nothing rash until they had a plan, but Ray wasn't stupid. She felt the shift immediately. Chia's glances were colder. His words clipped. He no longer touched her hand during prayer. She started checking his phone, watching him pace at night. And then, she heard just enough, fragments of a whispered phone call, a name she didn't recognize, an appointment that didn't match the calendar. She knew, that night, with Chia out meeting the attorney one last time, Ray stood in the hallway, barefoot and shaking, clutching a kitchen knife. She wasn't going to lose her family. Not without a fight. On March 1, 2024, at precisely 2:00 a.m., Ray Winston stood over her husband, Chia Meng Fong, as he sipped from the tea she'd secretly laced with sleeping pills. He had no idea what was coming. His steady, rhythmic breathing slowed until he was out cold, a deep, vulnerable sleep that left him defenseless. With a swift movement, Ray grabbed a butcher's knife from the kitchen, her hands shaking but determined. She approached Chia's slumbering form, staring down at him for a long, twisted moment. In her mind, this was the only way to keep her family intact. This was the only way to stop Chia from tearing her world apart. She plunged the knife into his chest, over and over again, focusing on the heart, the throat, places that would ensure he bled out. 42 times she stabbed him, each blow fueled by the pain of her delusions, her obsession, and a twisted sense of betrayal. The blood poured from his body, soaking the mattress, staining the walls, and splattering across the floor, but Ray wasn't finished. She took a moment to carve a word into his chest. Betrayal. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was a declaration. She believed he had betrayed her, that his actions would tear her from the one thing she cared about most. By the time the blood had congealed, and the room became eerily still, Ray had already disappeared. Javi, who had been staying at a friend's house for emotional support, returned the next morning. The air in the house was thick with an unnatural silence. He stepped into the living room, his footsteps tentative, unsure of what he'd find. When he reached his father's bedroom, he froze. His stomach churned, his pulse spiked, as he took in the horror that awaited him. There, in the bed, lay Chia, his father's mutilated body, drenched in blood. The word betrayal carved into his chest. A gut-wrenching scream tore from Javi's throat, but the sound felt hollow in the blood-soaked room. His father was dead. And Ray was gone. There was no trace of her. No sign of where she'd gone. Only the terrifying reality of what she had done, and the twisted nightmare Javi had just walked into. After the murder, Ray's escape was almost as calculated as the crime itself. She knew exactly what she had to do to vanish without a trace. With a stolen passport, a forged paternity certificate, claiming that Javi was the father of her unborn child, and a stack of childhood photos of him, she fled Singapore under the alias Raisa Omar. The woman who had been so publicly adored by expats and locals was now a fugitive, a shadow on the run, slipping through the cracks of the world she once tried so hard to perfect. Her journey was a relentless series of calculated moves. She boarded a ferry from Singapore to Batam, Indonesia, then made her way to Jakarta, taking every precaution to cover her tracks. She carefully constructed her new identity, posing as a Malaysian citizen, blending in with the crowds, hiding in plain sight. To the outside world, she was simply another expatriate with a past she refused to let go of. But behind her composed exterior, Ray was unraveling, and her delusions were growing more dangerous by the day. As weeks passed, Interpol launched a worldwide manhunt, tracking her every step across the globe. Authorities in Singapore were left to sift through the wreckage she'd left behind, uncovering chilling remnants of her obsession. A burner phone revealed thousands of text messages between Ray and Javi, messages that ranged from sweet affection to dark, manipulative commands. There were explicit videos, disturbing voice notes in which Ray called herself his real wife, and a blood-soaked letter she had left behind after the murder, where she'd written, "If I can't have you, no one will, not even your damn daddy." The chilling contents of this letter were a haunting testament to the depths of her madness, but Ray's escape would not last forever. 2 weeks after the murder, Indonesian authorities finally caught up with her. They raided a seedy Airbnb in Jakarta's notorious Glodok district, a part of the city where desperate souls seek refuge. There, in a dimly lit bathroom, they found her, a 6-week pregnant Ray, trembling, clutching a knife to her chest as if it could protect her from the world she had spiraled into. The air in the room was thick with tension, as she hummed a gospel tune, soft and eerie, as though she were trying to convince herself she was still the chosen one. When the officers moved in, Ray barely flinched. She met their eyes with an unsettling calmness. Her words were quiet, but their weight was undeniable. "He was mine first." And then, as they cuffed her, she spat on the arresting officer, her last act of defiance, a final, bitter assertion that her twisted love for Javi was a possession she would never let go of, no matter the cost. The fugitive wife, who had evaded capture for weeks, was finally behind bars, but the questions surrounding her twisted mind and dark obsession would continue to haunt everyone who had ever come into contact with her. Ray Winston, or Raisa Omar as she had called herself, had finally been caught, but the damage she'd left in her wake was only just beginning to unravel. The trial of Ray Winston was nothing short of explosive. From the moment she stepped into the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Ray, once the charming and composed figure who had captivated Singapore, now sat in a cold, steel-gray chair, her eyes vacant and distant, a stark contrast to the woman who had once so carefully curated her image as the perfect wife and mother. She was charged with first-degree murder, incest, child corruption, and fleeing justice. The charges were as horrifying as the crime itself, and the courtroom knew it would be no ordinary case. Ray's defense team, led by her lawyer, pleaded insanity. They painted a picture of a broken woman, traumatized by childhood sexual abuse and suffering from untreated bipolar disorder. They argued that her fractured mind had driven her to do things beyond her control, that the delusions she'd suffered were the catalyst for her unspeakable actions. They tried to convince the court that Ray wasn't capable of understanding the gravity of what she had done, that her manic episodes had warped her reality to such an extent that she didn't know right from wrong, but the prosecution, led by the sharp and unyielding Senior Deputy Public Prosecutor Ananya Krishnan, struck back with a fierce argument of premeditated malice. They didn't see a woman driven to madness, they saw a calculated predator. The evidence was damning, the trail of her obsession and manipulation inescapable. Psychological evaluations revealed that Ray had fantasized for months about building a new family with Javi, one in which he was more than just a son, he was her husband. The prosecution argued that she had planned every detail, every step, from the manipulation and grooming of Javi to the horrific murder of her husband, Chia. The courtroom was rocked when the prosecution played a chilling audio recording, one that had been recovered from Ray's burner phone. In it, her voice was steady, eerily calm, as she spoke about Javi. He gave birth to you, but I made you a man. That baby in me is proof. If he won't leave, I'll do it myself. The words sent a shiver through the room. It was clear that Ray had seen herself as the orchestrator of an unnatural, twisted fate, and that her obsession with Javi had driven her to take actions beyond anyone's comprehension. But the most devastating moment came when Javi himself took the stand. The courtroom fell into a tense, stunned silence as he stood before the judge, his face pale, eyes hollow. He had spent so long burying the horrors of the past, trying to forget the emotional manipulation, the constant fear, the guilt that had eaten away at him. But here, under the harsh lights of the courtroom, he had no choice but to confront the nightmare that had been his life for years. His voice cracked as he described the emotional and sexual abuse he had suffered at the hands of Ray. He spoke of the confusion, the shame, and the isolation he had felt, trapped in a web of manipulation and coercion he didn't know how to escape from. When he recounted the moment he found his father's mutilated body, tears streamed down his face. His words were choked with emotion, the burden of guilt and fear threatening to suffocate him. I couldn't stop it, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I was too afraid. I didn't know how to say no. And now he's dead. And he broke down, collapsing into sobs. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air, a haunting reminder of the twisted power Ray had over him. As Javi's testimony continued, it became clear just how far Ray's control had stretched, how deep her manipulation had run. The defense tried to discredit him, but the truth was undeniable. Ray had ensnared Javi in a web of psychological torture, and in his moment of deepest despair, he had been unable to escape. The final blow came when a blood-stained letter, written by Ray, was presented in court. In it, she had written the chilling words, "If I can't have you, no one will, not even your damn daddy." The letter was an undeniable testament to her dark obsession, her twisted view of love, and her willingness to destroy anyone who stood in the way of her delusions. The prosecution's case was clear. Ray Winston was not a woman driven by mental illness alone. She was a cold, calculating predator who had manipulated, groomed, and murdered in the name of a warped, possessive love. And as the trial unfolded, the courtroom watched, horrified, as the tangled web of Ray's obsession unraveled before their eyes. On November 22, 2024, after a 2-month-long trial that had captivated not only Singapore but the entire world, Ray Winston was found guilty on all counts. The courtroom was packed with a mix of spectators, reporters, and those still reeling from the disturbing details that had been laid bare over the course of the proceedings. The judge, his voice firm and unwavering, delivered the sentence, death by hanging, the maximum penalty for the horrific crime she had committed. His words were harsh, condemning Ray's actions as monstrous, manipulative, and a grotesque betrayal of every human boundary. There was no hint of mercy in his tone, no suggestion of compassion. Ray's face remained expressionless as the sentence was read, her demeanor eerily calm, almost unnervingly so. And then, in an almost theatrical gesture, she blew a kiss to the courtroom. "He'll come back to me in the next life," she said, her voice soft but chilling. It was as if she believed, in her delusion, that her crimes were not only justified but somehow inevitable, that the twisted love she had for Javi would transcend even death itself. There was no remorse in her eyes, no sorrow for the life she had destroyed, for the family she had shattered. Instead, there was a vacancy, a coldness, as though Ray had completely severed herself from any sense of reality. To her, the trial was not about justice, nor was it about the pain she had inflicted. It was about her, and only her delusions, her obsessions, her right to possess what she believed was hers. The court's verdict was just another step in her self-created narrative. But for Javi, the reality of the situation was far from simple. The young man, whose life had been turned upside down by Ray's manipulation and obsession, was left to pick up the shattered pieces of his existence. He had testified against his stepmother, recounting the abuse and the terror, his voice shaking with the weight of years of silence. After the trial, he entered witness protection, taking a new identity and disappearing from public view. His old life, the one he had shared with Ray and his father, was now a ghost. He would never be able to return to the life he had once known, and though he was free from Ray's grip, he was forever scarred by the horrors he had lived through. Javi spoke only once in a written statement after the trial, his words brief but revealing. "I was a child when she began to unravel my soul. I'm still trying to find the pieces." Those words resonated deeply with the public, for they spoke of the pain and confusion of a young man who had been trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the horrors until it was too late. The trauma would stay with him for the rest of his life, and the search for healing would be a long and difficult journey. And then there was the baby. Born prematurely in prison at just 7 months, the child, a girl, was taken from Ray's custody the moment she was born. Her mother had never held her in her arms, had never even been allowed a glimpse of the infant. The girl was placed into the custody of the state, a nameless child who would grow up without the shadow of her mother's name haunting her. She would never know the story of her mother, of the monstrous acts she had committed, nor the twisted obsession that had led to her conception. That in the end, Ray's legacy was one of destruction and despair. Singapore, and the world, would never forget the chilling saga of Ray Winston. The woman who crossed every line, shattered every boundary, and dragged a family into a nightmare of lust, control, and bloodshed. Her name would forever be associated with darkness, with madness, with the unthinkable. The courtroom had tried to deliver justice, but in many ways, there could be no justice for the lives she had destroyed. The wounds were too deep, the scars too permanent. As for Ray, she would meet her end not as the graceful, spiritual woman the world had once admired, but as the monster she had become. Her final breath would be taken in a cold, sterile prison cell, a woman who had once believed she could control everything, only to find herself trapped by her own twisted desires. She would die alone, leaving behind a legacy of horror that would echo through the halls of the courtroom, through the streets of Singapore, and into the hearts of those who had witnessed her fall from grace. The tragic story of Ray Winston is more than just a tale of murder. It is a chilling blueprint of how obsession can wear the mask of love, how manipulation can twist into devotion, and how those we trust most can become the very monsters we fear. Ray, once a seemingly loving wife and mother, devolved into something far darker, something much more dangerous. Her ability to disguise her deepest desires under the guise of maternal love, her obsession, and her disturbing need for control ultimately led to a series of irreversible actions. In the end, it was not love that drove her, it was an insatiable hunger for domination, for possession, for something she could never truly have. Ray's story leaves us questioning the nature of manipulation. Was she simply a victim of her own troubled past? Did her childhood trauma and mental illness justify the horrors she inflicted on her stepson, her family, and ultimately herself? Or, was Ray always a predator, waiting for the right prey to come along? One thing is certain. Ray's mind had long crossed a line that many would find unfathomable, but for her, it was the only reality she could see. As we reflect on this heartbreaking and shocking case, we leave you with a question: do you think Ray's past excuses her crimes? Or was she always a predator, lying in wait for her moment to strike? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this case shocked you, like and subscribe for more disturbing tales that peel back the curtain on the darkest parts of the human heart. Stay tuned for more stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature.